Despite being one of the oldest advanced economies in the world and the second largest in mainland Europe, France's capital city streets are now filled with uncollected garbage and surrounded by boarded-up shops that have had to close down. It is difficult to imagine that France was one of the first countries to initiate the Industrial Revolution with its current state of disarray. At the heart of these demonstrations lies the issue of finding alternative solutions to the economic problem of worker productivity. For any economy to thrive, it requires the functions of production, such as land, capital, and labor. While there are predictions that automation and artificial intelligence will eventually replace people in all sectors of the economy, the likelihood of this happening as quickly as anticipated is slim. Compared to other economies in the region, such as Germany, France has faced challenges in incorporating technical infrastructure into their highly technical industries and has relied more on labor than capital. This presents an issue for France as their population continues to age and spend more time in retirement, placing a greater burden on younger workers. This burden is either directly manifested in higher taxes that must be paid by those still working to provide public services for the elderly, or indirectly through unproductive members of society consuming an economy's resources without contributing in return. As people live longer, they are likely to spend more time as net economic burdens rather than providers. Although South Korea and some poorer countries face similar challenges, France is slightly different as it boasts a high birth rate of 1.81 children per woman on average, meaning that it can sustain its population even before immigration. This is in contrast to South Korea, which has a birth rate of only 0.84 children per woman on average, and lower levels of young immigrants entering the country to replace those who are aging out of the workforce. Despite their relatively comfortable position, the French government has taken emergency measures to implement retirement reforms that have proven to be widely unpopular among a significant portion of the population. In fact, some political commentators have suggested that this decision could cost the French government their re-election, indicating that it was not taken lightly. So, why is retirement reform so crucial for France? A fundamental principle of economics is that for a nation to achieve long-term economic growth, it needs more land, capital, or labor. Since most of the land on Earth is already accounted for, the options for economic growth are limited to improving labor and capital. Having more capital can involve investing in machinery, tools, and technology, or developing better products. Improving labor involves increasing the number of people working, increasing their productivity, or extending their working hours. Therefore, developing technology is typically the best long-term solution for improving overall living conditions, because it is not enough to achieve economic growth and prosperity with a high GDP number if it is achieved at the expense of people working themselves to exhaustion. On a macroeconomic level, France still appears to be performing well. Surprisingly, the country has a higher labor force participation rate than even the workaholic United States, with 73% of French residents between the ages of 15 and 65 employed compared to only 63% in the United States. Despite its reputation for having lazy workers, France has one of the highest labor force participation rates among advanced economies worldwide. Despite the positive macroeconomic metrics, France is the first developed country to have such visible reactions to issues that other countries have much worse. The reason for this is the relative strength of the French labor force. The French have robust work protections that allow them to protest without fear of losing their jobs. While a higher rate of French residents works, they work for fewer hours on average due to the country's culture of promoting work-life balance over pushing people to work as hard as possible to maximize economic output. The work protections in France also extended to long-term benefits, such as pensions, which fund the retirement of most French workers. These benefits, combined with the flexibility of working in France, explain why such a high percentage of the country actively participates in the labor market. However, this also explains why funding pensions is going to be a significant problem, as many people are going to be eligible for them, and they are relatively generous compared to most other economies. The French pension system comprises 3 pillars. The first pillar is the non-contributory minimum pension, which is a small amount provided to French residents over the age of 65 who lack the means to support themselves. This type of pension is funded by the French government, and the payment is less than €1,000 per month. The second pillar is voluntary private provisions, where individuals can save their money tax-free for retirement, similar to 401k or superannuation plans in other countries. The third pillar, which is causing the protests, is the mandatory pension provisions that require both employers and employees to contribute payroll taxes. The goal of this program is to provide workers with 70 to 80% of their highest earning year's income during retirement. The money invested is paid back to workers once they reach retirement age to ensure the program's sustainability. The eligibility age for these pensions is being increased. This approach not only keeps workers contributing to the economy for longer and paying contribution taxes, but it also reduces the time they will receive pension benefits on average. This is particularly important as people are starting to work later and live longer. While the economic rationale behind changing the eligibility rules for accessing pension benefits may be understandable, it is also evident why people are frustrated. After all, this money has been contributed by workers through their taxes throughout their entire working lives. In light of this dissatisfaction, what are some potential alternatives to consider? Although schemes like this can be innovative, they cannot avoid the fundamental macroeconomic reality that a shrinking workforce and a growing population of retirees will inevitably require additional funding from somewhere. While raising the retirement age has been one potential solution, it has faced significant opposition. Another possibility is to reduce the payout amounts for pensions, but this too is likely to be met with resistance. Encouraging more people to invest in voluntary retirement plans is another option, but for those who have already approached retirement age, it may be too late to start such a plan, especially if they have been anticipating a traditional pension throughout their working life. Another possible solution is to increase payroll taxes paid by workers and businesses, thereby injecting more funds into the system to support an increasing number of retirees. While this approach has been advocated by many organized movements, it still entails an economic trade-off. As more and more French workers retire, the government will need to find ways to balance the needs of retirees with the broader economic goals of the nation. France has a high labor force participation rate, but also struggles with high employment. This is particularly due to the extensive worker protections in place, which make it challenging for businesses to terminate employees once they are hired. While this system offers significant benefits to those who are already employed, it can make finding work more difficult, as companies are cautious about who they bring on board, given the difficulty of firing underperforming employees. The proposed solution of increasing payroll taxes may ultimately make French workers less attractive to employers. As France is a member of the EU, many companies have the option to easily hire workers from other countries. Additionally, France faces a significant issue with brain drain, as many highly productive workers do not benefit from worker protections, but do experience the negative impacts of labor market rigidities and higher taxes required to maintain those protections for average French workers. Consequently, French workers in high-demand positions may earn more by relocating to neighboring EU countries. This not only denies France the tax revenue necessary to fund pension schemes, but also reduces the country's economic productivity. Although the recent riots pose challenges, many economists are more concerned about larger economic issues facing France, such as brain drain and difficulties in implementing technology. These factors may have a more significant impact on the country's economy than even extended protests. While it is impossible to predict the future, France's economic challenges, including lower foreign income and increasing debt, are worrisome. France has a debt burden that is approaching 100% of its GDP, and some fear that this could trigger another debt crisis, given that it is the second largest economy in Europe. But what do you think? Would France finally solve their pension riddle? Comment your thoughts below. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay up to date with our latest uploads.